Chapter 8, Conclusion of the Mercantile System, by Adam Smith. Though the encouragement of exportation and the discouragement of importation are the two great engines by which the mercantile system proposes to enrich every country, yet, with regard to some particular commodities, it seems to follow an opposite plan: to discourage exportation and to encourage importation. Its ultimate object, however, it pretends, is always the same: to enrich the country by an advantageous balance of trade. It discourages the exportation of the materials of manufacture and of the instruments of trade in order to give our own workmen an advantage, and to enable them to undersell those of other nations in all foreign markets. And by restraining, in this manner, the exportation of a few commodities of no great price, it proposes to occasion a much greater and more valuable exportation of others. It encourages the importation of the materials of manufacture, in order that our own people may be enabled to work them up more cheaply, and thereby prevent a greater and more valuable importation of the manufactured commodities. I do not observe, at least in our statute book, any encouragement given to the importation of the instruments of trade. When manufactures have advanced to a certain pitch of greatness, the fabrication of the instruments of trade becomes itself the object of a great number of very important manufactures. To give any particular encouragement to the importation of such instruments would interfere too much with the interest of those manufactures. Such importation, therefore, instead of being encouraged, has frequently been prohibited. Thus the importation of wool cards, except from Ireland, or when brought in as wreck or prize goods, was prohibited by the 3rd of Edward IV, which prohibition was renewed by the 39th of Elizabeth, and has been continued and rendered perpetual by subsequent laws. The importation of the materials of manufacture has sometimes been encouraged by an exemption from the duties to which other goods are subject, and sometimes by bounties. The importation of sheep's wool from several different countries, of cotton wool from all countries, of undressed flax, of the greater part of dyeing drugs, of the greater part of undressed hides from Ireland, or the British colonies, of seal skins from the British Greenland fishery, of pig and bar iron from the British colonies, as well as of several other materials of manufacture, has been encouraged by an exemption from all duties, if properly entered at the custom house. The private interest of our merchants and manufacturers may, perhaps, have extorted from the legislature these exemptions, as well as the greater part of our other commercial regulations. They are, however, perfectly just and reasonable, and if, consistently with the necessities of the state, they could be extended to all the other materials of manufacture, the public would certainly be a gainer. The avidity of our great manufacturers, however, has in some cases extended these exemptions a good deal beyond what can justly be considered as the rude materials of their work. By the 24th Geo. II, Chap. 46, a small duty of only 1d. The pound was imposed upon the importation of foreign brown linen yarn, instead of much higher duties, to which it had been subjected before, viz., of 6d. The pound upon sail yarn of 1s. The pound upon all French and Dutch yarn, and of 2, 13. 4 upon the hundredweight of all spruce or Muscovia yarn. But our manufacturers were not long satisfied with this reduction. By the 29th of the same king, Chap. 15, the same law which gave a bounty upon the exportation of British and Irish linen, of which the price did not exceed the yard, even this small duty upon the importation of brown linen yarn was taken away. In the different operations, however, which are necessary for the preparation of linen yarn, a good deal more industry is employed than in the subsequent operation of preparing linen cloth from linen yarn. To say nothing of the industry of the flax growers and flax dressers, 3 or 4 spinners at least are necessary in order to keep one weaver in constant employment, and more than 4/5 of the whole quantity of labor necessary for the preparation of linen cloth is employed in that of linen yarn. But our spinners are poor people, women, commonly scattered about in all different parts of the country, without support or protection. It is not by the sale of their work, but by that of the complete work of the weavers, that our great master manufacturers make their profits. As it is their interest to sell the complete manufacture as dear, so it is to buy the materials as cheap as possible. By extorting from the legislature bounties upon the exportation of their own linen, high duties upon the importation of all foreign linen, and a total prohibition of the home consumption of some sorts of French linen, they endeavor to sell their own goods as dear as possible. By encouraging the importation of foreign linen yarn, and thereby bringing it into competition with that which is made by our own people, they endeavor to buy the work of the poor spinners as cheap as possible. They are as intent to keep down the wages of their own weavers as the earnings of the poor spinners, and it is by no means for the benefit of the workmen that they endeavor either to raise the price of the complete work or to lower that of the rude materials. It is the industry which is carried on for the benefit of the rich and the powerful that is principally encouraged by our mercantile system. That which is carried on for the benefit of the poor and the indigent is too often either neglected or oppressed. Both the bounty upon the exportation of linen and the exemption from the duty upon the importation of foreign yarn, which were granted only for 15 years, but continued by two different prolongations, expire with the end of the session of Parliament, which shall immediately follow the 24th of June, 1786. The encouragement given to the importation of the materials of manufacture by bounties has been principally confined to such as were imported from our American plantations. The first bounties of this kind were those granted about the beginning of the present century, upon the importation of naval stores from America. Under this denomination were comprehended timber fit for masts, yards, and bowsprits, hemp, tar, pitch, and turpentine. The bounty, however, of £1 the ton upon masting timber, and that of £6 the ton upon hemp, were extended to such as should be imported into England from Scotland. Both these bounties continued, without any variation, at the same rate, till they were severally allowed to expire. That upon hemp on the 1st of January 1741, and that upon masting timber at the end of the session of Parliament, immediately following the 24th June 1781. The bounties upon the importation of tar, pitch, and turpentine underwent during their continuance several alterations. Originally that upon tar was £4 the ton, that upon pitch the same, and that upon turpentine £3 the ton. The bounty of £4 the ton upon tar was afterwards confined to such as had been prepared in a particular manner. That upon other good, clean, and merchantable tar was reduced to £2, £4 the ton. The bounty upon pitch was likewise reduced to £1, and that upon turpentine to £1, tens, the ton. The second bounty upon the importation of any of the materials of manufacture, according to the order of time, was that granted by the 21st Geo. II. Chap. 30, upon the importation of indigo from the British plantations. When the plantation indigo was worth 3/4 of the price of the best French indigo, it was, by this act, entitled to a bounty of 6d. the pound. This bounty, which like most others was granted only for a limited time, was continued by several prolongations, but was reduced to 4d. the pound. It was allowed to expire with the end of the session of Parliament, which followed the 25th March 1781. The third bounty of this kind was that granted, much about the time that we were beginning sometimes to court, and sometimes to quarrel with our American colonies, by the 4th. Geo. III. Chap. 26 upon the importation of hemp or undressed flax from the British plantations. This bounty was granted for 21 years, from the 24th June 1764 to the 24th June 1785. For the first 7 years, it was to be at the rate of £8 the ton, for the second at £6, and for the third at £4. It was not extended to Scotland, of which the climate, although hemp is sometimes raised there in small quantities and of an inferior quality, is not very fit for that produce. Such a bounty upon the importation of Scotch flax in England would have been too great a discouragement to the native produce of the southern part of the United Kingdom. The fourth bounty of this kind was that granted by the 5th Geo. III. Chap. 45, upon the importation of wood from America. It was granted for 9 years from the 1st January 1766 to the 1st January 1775. During the first 3 years, it was to be for every 120 good deals, at the rate of £1, and for every load containing 50 cubic feet of other square timber at the rate of 12s. For the second 3 years, it was for deals to be at the rate of 15s, and for other squared timber at the rate of 8s. And for the third 3 years, it was for deals to be at the rate of 10s, and for every other squared timber at the rate of 5s. The fifth bounty of this kind was that granted by the 9th Geo. III. Chap. 38, upon the importation of raw silk from the British plantations. It was granted for 21 years, from the 1st January 1770 to the 1st January 1791. For the first 7 years, it was to be at the rate of £25 for every £100 value, for the second at £20, and for the third at £15. The management of the silkworm and the preparation of silk requires so much hand labor, and labor is so very dear in America, that even this great bounty, I have been informed, was not likely to produce any considerable effect. The sixth bounty of this kind was that granted by 11th Geo. III. Chap. 50 for the importation of pipe, hogshead, and barrel staves and leading from the British plantations. It was granted for 9 years, Frost January 1772 to the 1st January 1781. For the first 3 years, it was, for a certain quantity of each, to be at the rate of £6, for the second 3 years at £4, and for the third 3 years at £2. The seventh and last bounty of this kind was that granted by the 19th Geo. 3 Chap. 37, upon the importation of hemp from Ireland. It was granted in the same manner as that for the importation of hemp and undressed flax from America, for 21 years, from the 24th June 1779 to the 24th June 1800. The term is divided likewise into 3 periods, of 7 years each. And in each of those periods, the rate of the Irish bounty is the same with that of the American. It does not, however, like the American bounty, extend to the importation of undressed flax. It would have been too great a discouragement to the cultivation of that plant in Great Britain. When this last bounty was granted, the British and Irish legislatures were not in much better humor with one another than the British and American had been before. But this boon to Ireland, it is to be hoped, has been granted under more fortunate auspices than all those to America. The same commodities, upon which we thus gave bounties, when imported from America, were subjected to considerable duties when imported from any other country. The interest of our American colonies was regarded as the same with that of the mother country. Their wealth was considered as our wealth. Whatever money was sent out to them, it was said, came all back to us by the balance of trade, and we could never become a farthing the poorer by any expense which we could lay out upon them. They were our own in every respect, and it was an expense laid out upon the improvement of our own property, and for the profitable employment of our own people. It is unnecessary, I apprehend, at present to say anything further, in order to expose the folly of a system which fatal experience has now sufficiently exposed. Had our American colonies really been a part of Great Britain, those bounties might have been considered as bounties upon production, and would still have been liable to all the objections to which such bounties are liable, but to no other. The exportation of the materials of manufacture is sometimes discouraged by absolute prohibitions, and sometimes by high duties. Our woolen manufacturers have been more successful than any other class of workmen in persuading the legislature that the prosperity of the nation depended upon the success and extension of their particular business. They have not only obtained a monopoly against the consumers by an absolute prohibition of importing woolen cloths from any foreign country, but they have likewise obtained another monopoly against the sheep farmers and growers of wool by a similar prohibition of the exportation of live sheep and wool. The severity of many of the laws which have been enacted for the security of the revenue is very justly complained of, as imposing heavy penalties upon actions which, antecedent to the statutes that declared them to be crimes, had always been understood to be innocent. But the cruelest of our revenue laws, I will venture to affirm, are mild and gentle, in comparison to some of those which the clamor of our merchants and manufacturers has extorted from the legislature, for the support of their own absurd and oppressive monopolies. Like the laws of Draco, these laws may be said to be all written in blood. By the 8th of Elizabeth, Chap. 3, the exporter of sheep, lambs, or rams was for the first offense to forfeit all his goods forever, to suffer a year's imprisonment, and then to have his left hand cut off in a market town, upon a market day, to be there nailed up, and for the second offense to be adjudged a felon, and to suffer death accordingly. To prevent the breed of our sheep from being propagated in foreign countries seems to have been the object of this law. By the 13th anth of Charles II, Chap. 18, the exportation of wool was made felony, and the exporter subjected to the same penalties and forfeitures as a felon. For the honor of the national humanity, it is to be hoped that neither of these statutes was ever executed. The first of them, however, so far as I know, has never been directly repealed, and Serjeant Hawkins seems to consider it as still in force. It may, however, perhaps be considered as virtually repealed by the 12th of Charles II. Chap. 32, Sect. 3, which, without expressly taking away the penalties imposed by former statutes, imposes a new penalty, viz., that of 20s, for every sheep exported or attempted to be exported, together with the forfeiture of the sheep and of the owner's share of the sheep. The second of them was expressly repealed by the 7th anth of William III. Chap. 28, Sect. 4, by which it is declared that, whereas the statute of the 13th anth of King Charles II, made against the exportation of wool, among other things in the said act mentioned, doth enact the same to be deemed felony, by the severity of which penalty the prosecution of offenders hath not been so effectually put in execution. Be it therefore enacted, by the authority aforesaid, that so much of the said act, which relates to the making the said offense felony, be repealed and made void. The penalties, however, which are either imposed by this milder statute, or which, though imposed by former statutes, are not repealed by this one, are still sufficiently severe. Besides the forfeiture of the goods, the exporter incurs the penalty of threes. For every pound weight of wool, either exported or attempted to be exported, that is, about 4 or 5 times the value. Any merchant or other person convicted of this offense is disabled from requiring any debt or account belonging to him from any factor or other person. Let his fortune be what it will, whether he is or is not able to pay those heavy penalties, the law means to ruin him completely. But, as the morals of the great body of the people are not yet so corrupt as those of the contrivers of this statute, I have not heard that any advantage has ever been taken of this clause. If the person convicted of this offense is not able to pay the penalties within 3 months after judgment, he is to be transported for 7 years. And if he returns before the expiration of that term, he is liable to the pains of felony, without benefit of clergy. The owner of the ship, knowing this offense, forfeits all his interest in the ship and furniture. The master and mariners, knowing this offense, forfeit all their goods and chattels, and suffer 3 months' imprisonment. By a subsequent statute, the master suffers 6 months' imprisonment. In order to prevent exportation, the whole inland commerce of wool is laid under very burdensome and oppressive restrictions. It cannot be packed in any box, barrel, cask, case, chest, or any other package, but only in packs of leather or pack cloth, on which must be marked on the outside the words wool or yarn in large letters, not less than 3 inches long, on pain of forfeiting the same and the package ends. For every pound weight to be paid by the owner or packer. It cannot be loaded on any horse or cart, or carried by land within 5 miles of the coast, but between sun rising and sun setting, on pain of forfeiting the same, the horses and carriages. The 100 next adjoining to the sea coast, out of, or through which the wool is carried or exported, forfeits 20 pounds, if the wool is under the value of 10 pounds. And if of greater value, then treble that value, together with treble costs, to be sued for within the year. The execution to be against any 2 of the inhabitants, whom the sessions must reimburse, by an assessment on the other inhabitants, as in the cases of robbery. And if any person compounds with the 100 for less than this penalty, he is to be imprisoned for 5 years, and any other person may prosecute. These regulations take place through the whole kingdom. But in the particular counties of Kent and Sussex, the restrictions are still more troublesome. Every owner of wool within 10 miles of the sea coast must give an account in writing, 3 days after shearing, to the next officer of the customs, of the number of his fleeces, and of the places where they are lodged. And before he removes any part of them, he must give the like notice of the number and weight of the fleeces, and of the name and abode of the person to whom they are sold, and of the place to which it is intended they should be carried. No person within 15 miles of the sea, in the said counties, can buy any wool before he enters into bond to the king, that no part of the wool which he shall so buy shall be sold by him to any other person within 15 miles of the sea. If any wool is found carrying towards the seaside in the said counties, unless it has been entered and security given as aforesaid, it is forfeited, and the offender also forfeits threes. For every pound weight, if any person lay any wool, not entered as aforesaid, within 15 miles of the sea, it must be seized and forfeited. And if, after such seizure, any person shall claim the same, he must give security to the exchequer, that if he is cast upon trial he shall pay treble costs, besides all other penalties. When such restrictions are imposed upon the inland trade, the coasting trade, we may believe, cannot be left very free. Every owner of wool, who carrieth, or causeth to be carried, any wool to any port or place on the sea coast, in order to be from thence transported by sea to any other place or port on the coast, must first cause an entry thereof to be made at the port from whence it is intended to be conveyed, containing the weight, marks, and number of the packages, before he brings the same within 5 miles of that port, on pain of forfeiting the same, and also the horses, carts, and other carriages, and also of suffering and forfeiting, as by the other laws in force against the exportation of wool. This law, however, first of William III, chap. 32, is so very indulgent as to declare that this shall not hinder any person from carrying his wool home from the place of shearing, though it be within 5 miles of the sea, provided that in 10 days after shearing, and before he remove the wool, he do under his hand certify to the next officer of the customs the true number of fleeces, and where it is housed, and do not remove the same without certifying to such officer, under his hand, his intention so to do, 3 days before. Bond must be given that the wool to be carried coastways is to be landed at the particular port for which it is entered outwards. And if my part of it is landed without the presence of an officer, not only the forfeiture of the wool is incurred, as in other goods, but the usual additional penalty of threes. For every pound weight is likewise incurred. Our woolen manufacturers, in order to justify their demand of such extraordinary restrictions and regulations, confidently asserted that English wool was of a peculiar quality, superior to that of any other country, that the wool of other countries could not, without some mixture of it, be wrought up into any tolerable manufacture, that fine cloth could not be made without it, that England, therefore, if the exportation of it could be totally prevented, could monopolize to herself almost the whole woolen trade of the world, and thus, having no rivals, could sell at what price she pleased, and in a short time acquire the most incredible degree of wealth by the most advantageous balance of trade. This doctrine, like most other doctrines which are confidently asserted by any considerable number of people, was, and still continues to be, most implicitly believed by a much greater number, by almost all those who are either unacquainted with the woolen trade or who have not made particular inquiries. It is, however, so perfectly false that English wool is in any respect necessary for the making of fine cloth that it is altogether unfit for it. Fine cloth is made altogether of Spanish wool. English wool cannot be even so mixed with Spanish wool as to enter into the composition without spoiling and degrading, in some degree, the fabric of the cloth. It has been shown in the foregoing part of this work that the effect of these regulations has been to depress the price of English wool, not only below what it naturally would be in the present times, but very much below what it actually was in the time of Edward Roman III. The price of Scotch wool, when, in consequence of the Union, it became subject to the same regulations, is said to have fallen about one half. It is observed by the very accurate and intelligent author of the Memoirs of Wool, the Reverend Mr. John Smith, that the price of the best English wool in England is generally below what wool of a very inferior quality commonly sells for in the market of Amsterdam. To depress the price of this commodity below what may be called its natural and proper price was the avowed purpose of those regulations, and there seems to be no doubt of their having produced the effect that was expected from them. This reduction of price, it may perhaps be thought, by discouraging the growing of wool, must have reduced very much the annual produce of that commodity, though not below what it formerly was, yet below what, in the present state of things, it would probably have been had it, in consequence of an open and free market, been allowed to rise to the natural and proper price. I am, however, disposed to believe that the quantity of the annual produce cannot have been much, though it may, perhaps, have been a little affected by these regulations. The growing of wool is not the chief purpose for which the sheep farmer employs his industry and stock. He expects his profit, not so much from the price of the fleece, as from that of the carcass, and the average or ordinary price of the latter must even, in many cases, make up to him whatever deficiency there may be in the average or ordinary price of the former. It has been observed, in the foregoing part of this work, that whatever regulations tend to sink the price, either of wool or of raw hides, below what it naturally would be, must, in an improved and cultivated country, have some tendency to raise the price of butcher's meat. The price, both of the great and small cattle which are fed on improved and cultivated land, must be sufficient to pay the rent which the landlord, and the profit which the farmer, has reason to expect from improved and cultivated land. If it is not, they will soon cease to feed them. Whatever part of this price, therefore, is not paid by the wool and the hide, must be paid by the carcass. The less there is paid for the one, the more must be paid for the other. In what manner this price is to be divided upon the different parts of the beast is indifferent to the landlords and farmers, provided it is all paid to them. In an improved and cultivated country, therefore, their interest as landlords and farmers cannot be much affected by such regulations, though their interest as consumers may, by the rise in the price of provisions. According to this reasoning, therefore, this degradation in the price of wool is not likely, in an improved and cultivated country, to occasion any diminution in the annual produce of that commodity, except so far as, by raising the price of mutton, it may somewhat diminish the demand for, and consequently the production of, that particular species of butcher's meat. Its effect, however, even in this way, it is probable, is not very considerable. But though its effect upon the quantity of the annual produce may not have been very considerable, its effect upon the quality, it may perhaps be thought, must necessarily have been very great. The degradation in the quality of English wool, if not below what it was in former times, yet below what it naturally would have been in the present state of improvement and cultivation, must have been, it may perhaps be supposed, very nearly in proportion to the degradation of price. As the quality depends upon the breed, upon the pasture, and upon the management and cleanliness of the sheep, during the whole progress of the growth of the fleece, the attention to these circumstances, it may naturally enough be imagined, can never be greater than in proportion to the recompense which the price of the fleece is likely to make for the labor and expense which that attention requires. It happens, however, that the goodness of the fleece depends, in a great measure, upon the health, growth, and bulk of the animal. The same attention which is necessary for the improvement of the carcass is, in some respect, sufficient for that of the fleece. Notwithstanding the degradation of price, English wool is said to have been improved considerably during the course even of the present century. The improvement might, perhaps, have been greater if the price had been better, but the lowness of price, though it may have obstructed, yet certainly it has not altogether prevented that improvement. The violence of these regulations, therefore, seems to have affected neither the quantity nor the quality of the annual produce of wool, so much as it might have been expected to do, though I think it probable that it may have affected the latter a good deal more than the former. And the interest of the growers of wool, though it must have been hurt in some degree, seems upon the whole to have been much less hurt than could well have been imagined. These considerations, however, will not justify the absolute prohibition of the exportation of wool, but they will fully justify the imposition of a considerable tax upon that exportation. To hurt, in any degree, the interest of any one order of citizens, for no other purpose but to promote that of some other, is evidently contrary to that justice and equality of treatment which the sovereign owes to all the different orders of his subjects. But the prohibition certainly hurts, in some degree, the interest of the growers of wool, for no other purpose but to promote that of the manufacturers. Every different order of citizens is bound to contribute to the support of the sovereign or commonwealth. A tax of 5, or even of 10 shillings, upon the exportation of every tod of wool, would produce a very considerable revenue to the sovereign. It would hurt the interest of the growers somewhat less than the prohibition, because it would not probably lower the price of wool quite so much. It would afford a sufficient advantage to the manufacturer, because, though he might not buy his wool altogether so cheap as under the prohibition, he would still buy it at least 5 or 10 shillings cheaper than any foreign manufacturer could buy it, besides saving the freight and insurance which the other would be obliged to pay. It is scarce possible to devise a tax which could produce any considerable revenue to the sovereign, and at the same time occasion so little inconveniency to anybody. The prohibition, notwithstanding all the penalties which guard it, does not prevent the exportation of wool. It is exported, it is well known, in great quantities. The great difference between the price in the home and that in the foreign market presents such a temptation to smuggling, that all the rigor of the law cannot prevent it. This illegal exportation is advantageous to nobody but the smuggler. A legal exportation, subject to a tax, by affording a revenue to the sovereign, and thereby saving the imposition of some other, perhaps more burdensome and inconvenient taxes, might prove advantageous to all the different subjects of the state. The exportation of fuller's earth, or fuller's clay, supposed to be necessary for preparing and cleansing the woolen manufactures, has been subjected to nearly the same penalties as the exportation of wool. Even tobacco pipe clay, though acknowledged to be different from fuller's clay, yet, on account of their resemblance, and because fuller's clay might sometimes be exported as tobacco pipe clay, has been laid under the same prohibitions and penalties. By the 13th anth of Charles II, Chap. 7, the exportation, not only of raw hides but of tan leather, except in the shape of boots, shoes, or slippers, was prohibited, and the law gave a monopoly to our bootmakers and shoemakers, not only against our graziers but against our tanners. By subsequent statutes, our tanners have got themselves exempted from this monopoly, upon paying a small tax of only 1 shilling on the hundredweight of tan leather, weighing 112 pounds. They have obtained likewise the drawback of 2/3 of the excise duties imposed upon their commodity, even when exported without further manufacture. All manufactures of leather may be exported duty-free, and the exporter is besides entitled to the drawback of the whole duties of excise. Our graziers still continue subject to the old monopoly. Graziers, separated from one another, and dispersed through all the different corners of the country, cannot, without great difficulty, combine together for the purpose either of imposing monopolies upon their fellow citizens, or of exempting themselves from such as may have been imposed upon them by other people. Manufacturers of all kinds, collected together in numerous bodies in all great cities, easily can. Even the horns of cattle are prohibited to be exported, and the two insignificant trades of the horner and comb maker enjoy, in this respect, a monopoly against the graziers. Restraints, either by prohibitions or by taxes, upon the exportation of goods which are partially, but not completely manufactured, are not peculiar to the manufacture of leather. As long as anything remains to be done, in order to fit any commodity for immediate use and consumption, our manufacturers think that they themselves ought to have the doing of it. Woolen yarn and worsted are prohibited to be exported. Under the same penalties as wool, even white cloths, we subject to a duty upon exportation, and our dyers have so far obtained a monopoly against our clothiers. Our clothiers would probably have been able to defend themselves against it, but it happens that the greater part of our principal clothiers are themselves likewise dyers. Watch cases, clock cases, and dial plates for clocks and watches have been prohibited to be exported. Our clockmakers and watchmakers are, it seems, unwilling that the price of this sort of workmanship should be raised upon them by the competition of foreigners. By some old statutes of Edward III, Henry VIII, and Edward VI, the exportation of all metals was prohibited. Lead and tin were alone excepted, probably on account of the great abundance of those metals, in the exportation of which a considerable part of the trade of the kingdom in those days consisted. For the encouragement of the mining trade, the 5th of William and Mary, chap. 17, exempted from this prohibition iron, copper, and mundic metal made from British ore. The exportation of all sorts of copper bars, foreign as well as British, was afterwards permitted by the 9th Anth of William III, chap. 26. The exportation of unmanufactured brass, of what is called gun metal, bell metal, and shroff metal, still continues to be prohibited. Brass manufactures of all sorts may be exported duty-free. The exportation of the materials of manufacture, where it is not altogether prohibited, is, in many cases, subjected to considerable duties. By the 8th Geo. I chap. 15, the exportation of all goods, the produce of manufacture of Great Britain, upon which any duties had been imposed by former statutes, was rendered duty-free. The following goods, however, were excepted: alum, lead, leador, tin, tanned leather, copperas, coals, wool, cards, white woolen cloths, lapis calaminaris, skins of all sorts, glue, coney hair or wool, hare's wool, hair of all sorts, horses, and litharge of lead. If you accept horses, all these are either materials of manufacture or incomplete manufactures, which may be considered as materials for still further manufacture or instruments of trade. This statute leaves them subject to all the old duties which had ever been imposed upon them, the old subsidy, and 1% outwards. By the same statute, a great number of foreign drugs for dyers' use are exempted from all duties upon importation. Each of them, however, is afterwards subjected to a certain duty, not indeed a very heavy one, upon exportation. Our dyers, it seems, while they thought it for their interest to encourage the importation of those drugs, by an exemption from all duties, thought it likewise for their own interest to throw some small discouragement upon their exportation. The avidity, however, which suggested this notable piece of mercantile ingenuity, most probably disappointed itself of its object. It necessarily taught the importers to be more careful than they might otherwise have been, that their importation should not exceed what was necessary for the supply of the home market. The home market was at all times likely to be more scantily supplied. The commodities were at all times likely to be somewhat dearer there than they would have been, had the exportation been rendered as free as the importation. By the above-mentioned statute, gum Seneca, or gum Arabic, being among the enumerated dyeing drugs, might be imported duty-free. They were subjected, indeed, to a small poundage duty, amounting only to 3d in the hundredweight, upon their re-exportation. France enjoyed, at that time, an exclusive trade to the country most productive of those drugs, that which lies in the neighborhood of the Senegal, and the British market could not be easily supplied by the immediate importation of them from the place of growth. By the 25th Geo. II. Therefore, gum Seneca was allowed to be imported, contrary to the general dispositions of the Act of Navigation, from any part of Europe. As the law, however, did not mean to encourage this species of trade, so contrary to the general principles of the mercantile policy of England, it imposed a duty of 10 shillings the hundredweight upon such importation, and no part of this duty was to be afterwards drawn back upon its exportation. The successful war which began in 1755 gave Great Britain the same exclusive trade to those countries which France had enjoyed before. Our manufacturers, as soon as the peace was made, endeavored to avail themselves of this advantage and to establish a monopoly in their own favor both against the growers and against the importers of this commodity. By the 5th of Geo. III. Therefore, Chap. 37, the exportation of gum Seneca from His Majesty's dominions in Africa was confined to Great Britain and was subjected to all the same restrictions, regulations, forfeitures, and penalties as that of the enumerated commodities of the British colonies in America and the West Indies. Its importation, indeed, was subjected to a small duty of sixpence the hundredweight, but its re-exportation was subjected to the enormous duty of £1 10 the hundredweight. It was the intention of our manufacturers that the whole produce of those countries should be imported into Great Britain, and in order that they themselves might be enabled to buy it at their own price, that no part of it should be exported again, but at such an expense as would sufficiently discourage that exportation. Their avidity, however, upon this, as well as upon many other occasions, disappointed itself of its object. This enormous duty presented such a temptation to smuggling that great quantities of this commodity were clandestinely exported, probably to all the manufacturing countries of Europe, but particularly to Holland, not only from Great Britain but from Africa. Upon this account, by the 14th Geo. III. Chap. 10, this duty upon exportation was reduced to 5 shillings the hundredweight. In the Book of Rates, according to which the old subsidy was levied, beaver skins were estimated at 6 shillings and 8 pence apiece, and the different subsidies and imposts which, before the year 1722, had been laid upon their importation, amounted to 1/5 part of the rate, or to 16 pence upon each skin, all of which, except half the old subsidy, amounting only to 2pence, was drawn back upon exportation. This duty, upon the importation of so important a material of manufacture, had been thought too high, and, in the year 1722, the rate was reduced to 2 shillings and 6 pence, which reduced the duty upon importation to 6 pence, and of this only 1/2 was to be drawn back upon exportation. The same successful war put the country most productive of beaver under the dominion of Great Britain, and beaver skins being among the enumerated commodities, the exportation from America was consequently confined to the market of Great Britain. Our manufacturers soon bethought themselves of the advantage which they might make of this circumstance, and in the year 1764, the duty upon the importation of beaver skin was reduced to 1 penny, but the duty upon exportation was raised to 7 pence each skin, without any drawback of the duty upon importation. By the same law, a duty of 18 pence the pound was imposed upon the exportation of beaver wool or wounds, without making any alteration in the duty upon the importation of that commodity, which, when imported by British and in British shipping, amounted at that time to between 4 pence and 5 pence the piece. Coals may be considered both as a material of manufacture and as an instrument of trade. Heavy duties, accordingly, have been imposed upon their exportation, amounting at present 1783 to more than 5 shillings the ton, or more than 15 shillings the Chaldron-Newcastle measure, which is, in most cases, more than the original value of the commodity at the coal pit, or even at the shipping port for exportation. The exportation, however, of the instruments of trade, properly so called, is commonly restrained, not by high duties but by absolute prohibitions. Thus, by the 7th Anth of William III Chap. 20 sect. 8, the exportation of frames or engines for knitting gloves or stockings is prohibited under the penalty, not only of the forfeiture of such frames or engines, so exported or attempted to be exported, but of £40, 1/2 to the king, the other to the person who shall inform or sue for the same. In the same manner by the 14th Geo. III. Chap. 71, the exportation to foreign parts of any utensils made use of in the cotton, linen, woolen, and silk manufactures is prohibited under the penalty, not only of the forfeiture of such utensils, but of £200 to be paid by the person who shall offend in this manner, and likewise of £200 to be paid by the master of the ship, who shall knowingly suffer such utensils to be loaded on board his ship. When such heavy penalties were imposed upon the exportation of the dead instruments of trade, it could not well be expected that the living instrument, the artificer, should be allowed to go free. Accordingly, by the 5th Geo. Chap. 27, the person who shall be convicted of enticing any artificer, of or in any of the manufactures of Great Britain, to go into any foreign parts, in order to practice or teach his trade, is liable, for the first offense, to be fined in any sum not exceeding £100, and to 3 months' imprisonment, and until the fine shall be paid, and for the second offense to be fined in any sum at the discretion of the court, and to imprisonment for 12 months, and until the fine shall be paid. By the 23d Geo. Roman 2. Chap. 13. This penalty is increased for the first offense to £500 for every artificer so enticed, and to 12 months' imprisonment, and until the fine shall be paid, and for the second offense to £1,000 and to 2 years' imprisonment, and until the fine shall be paid. By the former of these two statutes, upon proof that any person has been enticing any artificer, or that any artificer has promised or contracted to go into foreign parts, for the purposes aforesaid, such artificer may be obliged to give security, at the discretion of the court, that he shall not go beyond the seas, and may be committed to prison until he give such security. If any artificer has gone beyond the seas, and is exercising or teaching his trade in any foreign country, upon warning being given to him by any of His Majesty's ministers or consuls abroad, or by one of His Majesty's secretaries of state, for the time being, if he does not, within 6 months after such warning, return into this realm, and from henceforth abide and inhabit continually within the same, he is from thenceforth declared incapable of taking any legacy devised to him within this kingdom, or of being executor or administrator to any person, or of taking any lands within this kingdom, by descent, devise, or purchase. He likewise forfeits to the king all his lands, goods, and chattels, is declared an alien in every respect, and is put out of the king's protection. It is unnecessary, I imagine, to observe how contrary such regulations are to the boasted liberty of the subject, of which we affect to be so very jealous, but which, in this case, is so plainly sacrificed to the feudal interests of our merchants and manufacturers. The laudable motive of all these regulations is to extend our own manufactures, not by their own improvement, but by the depression of those of all our neighbors, and by putting an end, as much as possible, to the troublesome competition of such odious and disagreeable rivals. Our master manufacturers think it reasonable that they themselves should have the monopoly of the ingenuity of all their countrymen, though by restraining, in some trades, the number of apprentices which can be employed at one time, and by imposing the necessity of a long apprenticeship in all trades, they endeavor, all of them, to confine the knowledge of their respective employments to as small a number as possible. They are unwilling, however, that any part of this small number should go abroad to instruct foreigners. Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to, only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. The maxim is so perfectly self-evident that it would be absurd to attempt to prove it. But in the mercantile system, the interest of the consumer is almost constantly sacrificed to that of the producer, and it seems to consider production, and not consumption, as the ultimate end and object of all industry and commerce. In the restraints upon the importation of all foreign commodities which can come into competition with those of our own growth or manufacture, the interest of the home consumer is evidently sacrificed to that of the producer. It is altogether for the benefit of the latter that the former is obliged to pay that enhancement of price which this monopoly almost always occasions. It is altogether for the benefit of the producer that bounties are granted upon the exportation of some of his productions. The home consumer is obliged to pay, first the tax which is necessary for paying the bounty, and, secondly, the still greater tax which necessarily arises from the enhancement of the price of the commodity in the home market. The famous Treaty of Commerce with Portugal, the consumer is prevented by duties from purchasing of a neighboring country, a commodity which our own climate does not produce, but is obliged to purchase it of a distant country, though it is acknowledged that the commodity of the distant country is of a worse quality than that of the near one. The home consumer is obliged to submit to this inconvenience, in order that the producer may import into the distant country some of his productions, upon more advantageous terms than he otherwise would have been allowed to do. The consumer, too, is obliged to pay whatever enhancement in the price of those very productions this forced exportation may occasion in the home market. But in the system of laws which has been established for the management of our American and West Indian colonies, the interest of the home consumer has been sacrificed to that of the producer, with a more extravagant profusion than in all our other commercial regulations. A great empire has been established for the sole purpose of raising up a nation of customers, who should be obliged to buy, from the shops of our different producers, all the goods with which these could supply them. For the sake of that little enhancement of price, which this monopoly might afford our producers, the home consumers have been burdened with the whole expense of maintaining and defending that empire. For this purpose, and for this purpose only, in the two last wars, more than 200 millions have been spent, and a new debt of more than 170 millions has been contracted, over and above all that had been expended for the same purpose in former wars. The interest of this debt alone is not only greater than the whole extraordinary profit, which, it never could be pretended, was made by the monopoly of the colony trade, but than the whole value of that trade, or than the whole value of the goods which, at an average, have been annually exported to the colonies. It cannot be very difficult to determine who have been the contrivers of this whole mercantile system. Not the consumers, we may believe, whose interest has been entirely neglected, but the producers, whose interest has been so carefully attended to. And among this latter class, our merchants and manufacturers have been by far the principal architects. In the mercantile regulations which have been taken notice of in this chapter, the interest of our manufacturers has been most peculiarly attended to, and the interest, not so much of the consumers, as that of some other sets of producers, has been sacrificed to it.